It's time for day 6. We've gotten through our big three, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. What comes after that? What happens next in the history of philosophy for us? Gaarder goes on and jumps into Hellenistic thought, although I'm going to be really honest, there's a lot that's going on during this period that he's describing, and it would be very easy to just pass through most of it a little too quickly. This is an introductory course on philosophy, so we can only cover so much, but I am going to provide a few additional details that Gaarder sort of passes by or jumps through, including those, or maybe especially those, that are still very relevant today. Not all of these philosophical movements are ancient history, as can sometimes be given the sense. So let's talk about these guys for a second. Here you can see a few busts that are in, I believe it's the London Museum. It's a famous museum in London, and they're in the same room together. And we saw them last time, and seemed to hint that there might be something to do with them and the virtue ethics of Aristotle we were talking about. And there is definitely something to be said here. Let's start from left to right. The left is Socrates. We know who that is. But then who is this Antisthenes, Chrysippus, and Aurelius at the far end there? Well, these are the other people who comprise this, among those who comprise this period that we're going to call Hellenism. The culture is actually Hellenism, and Hellenistic thought or Hellenistic philosophy is being developed during this time. But what is this about being a culture of Greece and ancient Greece? Why do we need this word? Isn't Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, they were Greek, they were Athenian. Why do we need this word Hellenistic? Well, historically speaking, this is during a time when there's been massive change throughout this part of the world and the Mediterranean, around the Mediterranean. So Alexander the Great, student of Aristotle, has conquered massive land, both to the north and to the east of the Mediterranean Sea. And now he has died, 323 BC. He's now deceased. And the successors are who you might think could now govern those lands with the same sort of unity and benevolence that Alexander did. That things are just going to be hunky-dory. Well, not at all. Actually, what happens is those successors end up squabbling and fighting over stuff, and these lands end up being, including modern-day Turkey and other areas like that, are essentially awash with terrible political scandal and warfare and so forth. There's a lot going on. There's turmoil all over the place. And not too long after this point, after this Hellenistic point, we're going to see the rise of a new leadership in the ancient world, namely Rome. So what we're really doing here, and what Gaarder may not be specifically pointing out, is we're really moving from this ancient period of Greek history into the Hellenistic period, where what we'll need to do is distinguish between this schooling that is Greek, this Greek schooling, this Greek thought, and that being contrasted against the rest of the world, both in the Middle East and Rome, as it rises up. And as that rising of Rome happens, we're really sort of moving into what's called the classical period of philosophy and history. So there's a lot going on during this period, and we need a term like Hellenism in order to, again, distinguish between what is mostly still of Greek origin, because Greece really did, Athens in particular, rocked the philosophy world, rocked the world of education in this area. And so giving a sense of what is still Greek or what is Hellenistic ends up being pretty important here. Now, let's take a look at these thinkers and see what they have to do with Socrates and why we care about them. So here you can see at the top, Socrates. his 470 BC, 399 BC time period in which he probably lived, that he appears to have lived. And you can see, if we follow this branch to the left, you can see what we've already pretty much exclusively talked about here, which is Plato's Academy and Aristotelianism and the Lyceum built by Aristotle. So we've got Plato and Aristotle. These are the big three in my book. And this is typically two. This is the canon, as it were. This is most of everything that comes after this is going to be influenced by these two head honchos here. But there was more philosophy going on than that, both during and after the time of Socrates, and those did make an impact on the world, and we're going to see them reappear later on in history too. Specifically, we have over here the Cyrenaics and the Cynics. Now, Gaarder only goes into describing these three on the right-hand side here: Epicureanism, Cynicism, and then Stoicism. But you can see that the tree that I've derived from John Stuart Gordon's diagram and have appended just a little bit more to it, you can see that there is a lot more going on than that. Why do we have Epicureanism? Why do we have Stoicism? Why is Stoicism shown in direct relationship to Cynicism, but obviously kind of branches off from it too? So the Cyrenaics included those like Aristippus, who Gaarder does mention, who was influenced directly by Socrates, and Antisthenes, who we saw the bust of a moment ago sitting right next to Socrates. Antisthenes as more or less the founder of Cynicism. But why are there three branches to begin with? Were they not Platonic enough? What was going on here? Well, they were each dealing with a different part of what Socrates himself, in his kind of amazing qualities, the incredible number of things that he seems to have influenced others by. There are three different major strands of thought that we could sort of oversimplify. We're at risk of oversimplifying, but that's what happens sometimes, and it helps us characterize these things. So over here, Plato was super influenced by Socrates' idea of the good, right? The good, and how that gives birth to the forms for him, the eidos and the idea, and the good itself as agathon, and again, doing my best to pronounce the Greek here. And that philosophy, the metaphysics that he derives from the work from what he understands of his teacher Socrates, is what ends up influencing Aristotle's metaphysics. And so what you have is you have Socrates seeming to speak specifically of an ethics, right? How does one live a good life? The unexamined life is not worth living, and so forth. But that ends up influencing this branch over here that really wants to take on then both that ethical view, that ethical stance, or at least some version of ethics. If you start from Aristotle onward, that's very similar, but also very different in some ways to what Socrates was saying. But then also a metaphysics, an ontology, something that tells us why things are that way. What is it about the world? What is it about what's true of the world that makes it a world that we live in it this way for? Or why we live this way at all? These other two then are tackling different aspects of something else. Eudaimonia, if you remember that word that we brought up before, that word eudaimonia is super important here again. Eudaimonia was what again? One of those words that's really hard to translate into English, actually, but we can sort of interpret it as the good life. What makes for the good life, right? This was an important question to Socrates. And both the Cyrenaics and the Cynics were, in some sense, attempting to answer it, albeit in extremely different ways. I want to say even opposite ways. Aristippus seemed to believe in pleasure as what we're to take away from this. And so we have the birth of what is called hedonism. The word hedonism reflects the idea of pleasure, that there are things that are more pleasurable, of course, and things that are less pleasurable in life. And for Aristippus and other Cyrenaics later on, he believes that what we can only do, we cannot directly influence our ability to be happy, right? If eudaimonia is about leading the good life, and happiness might be an important part of that. We saw Aristotle said it's actually the final, most important thing that pulls us into maturing as human beings, that happiness is what it's all about. For the Cyrenaics, it's more like happiness is a side effect. Happiness is something that comes about by in pursuing what is pleasurable and simply enjoying life, as it were. You're inadvertently, hopefully contributing to the possibility of experiencing happiness or leading a good life in that sense. And so this is looked down upon a lot of the time later on, but it'll become really important for Epicurus later on. So Aristippus eventually is overthrown, you could say, or we should say not overthrown so much as is overshadowed by later Cyrenaics, who also have similar ideas, but start to trend back towards the idea of, no, happiness really is the main focus here. Happiness is what it's about. Maybe they were influenced by Aristotelian virtue ethics, the Nicomachean ethics, and so forth. And eventually what you have is you have Epicurus coming onto the scene and saying, yeah, this is really important. We'll say more about him in a second. But let's not go too far down that road, because I want to speak also about skepticism. Gaarder didn't mention that at all. I'm actually fairly surprised. Pyrrho of Elis was an extremely important thinker here in down this avenue that the Cyrenaics were also interested in. Not just in eudaimonia, but this additional question of what Socrates was talking about around ignorance. Remember Socratic ignorance? Well, there are these two important words we're going to throw. More Greek, a lot of Greek today. Two more important words here. Agnoia, which refers to ignorance, Greek word essentially for ignorance, of the sort that I don't know something. And then you have amathia. And amathia is, or amathia, if it might be that one actually in pronunciation. Amathia it refers not to not knowing something so much as deliberately or let's say intentionally sometimes, or at least incidentally not knowing. So what is so of these two? What is the Socratic ignorance part? Socratic ignorance maybe has more to do with this agnoia. We just are born not knowing things. We're born fairly ignorant, right? And it compounds if we're not careful. It can compound to not even knowing that we don't know. Amathia is where we can talk about the good and evil of the world in a sense, right? If what Socrates seems bent on reminding us of time and again is that the only real good is wisdom, although some will characterize that as knowing, but that's all right, wisdom. And the only real evil is ignorance. So why this begs the question, why do sometimes intelligent people do evil things? Why do they do such terrible things? If truly, if we take on Socrates' idea that people never knowingly do wrong, that they never knowingly do evil, what accounts for the fact that there are some very intelligent people in the world who nonetheless seem to do these evil things? You can go to, international corporate, CEOs who maybe even create educational institutions and such that are supposed to help people and just really rob them of money. Or you can go to, there are all sorts of venues for this, for intelligent people who do wrong things. How do we explain their existence or how they operate in the world? Well, amathia. We can say that they are just knowledgeable enough of doing something wrong, but they're not aware of the ignorance that is wrapped up in that doing. They think they're doing something that is actually ultimately going to be good and right. This is sort of, again, going down this path of Aristotle, where it's like you're really just trying to to get to the final form of happiness, as it were. But in this case, you're doing it in a way that really is completely steeped in ignorance of what sort of consequences there will be, or how that will ultimately make things worse for you. So we have to be mindful of that in the world, as it were, even when people do really terrible things as intelligent people, maybe they're simply not aware of what sort of environment they're breeding and how people will ultimately end up in the end treating them. Now, again, the Cyrenaics were taking on a little bit of both of these, where on the one hand you had eudaimonia, the good life, and on the other hand you had amathia, there's question, and in that, ignorance itself, agnoia, what can we know of the world? Socrates kept making that claim, right? The only thing I know for sure is that I know nothing. This was taken to heart, and so you can kind of see this split, where Epicurus down here, again, oversimplified a little bit here, but let's just do it for argument's sake. Epicurus down here takes on particularly this aspect of the what is the good life, the eudaimonia thread. And the skeptics up here take on this new thread of, or this other thread of amathia and agnoia, what can we truly know about the world? And they take that to a far logical extent, possibly its farthest extent, and made a huge impact in the world too that seems to have been left out actually in Sophie's world. And then this last part over here, cynicism, we'll see some prominent figures in there too, but as Antisthenes was really particularly impacted by Socrates' way of living. Not so much, you can see 455 BC, it's around the time of Plato too. He's around during the same time, but he's not so interested, as it were, in the metaphysics. Even the Cyrenaics and Epicureans and so forth, they still have a little bit of that thread of the metaphysical aspect of the world and maybe what the good is and so forth. Not so much as the academy, of course. But the Cynics here, not so, very much more interested in how do we live? So cynicism, cynic, these come from the words actually kainokos or kainos. So kainokos is dog-like, right? We have the word canine that comes from the same source, kainos, I believe it is. But kainokos means to be dog-like. And they really did, in a sense, start to resemble this. And starting from Antisthenes onward, how can I take less from the world? How can I live in the world as frugally as possible? Because if the true things that are good in the world, so there is some good there, right? If the true good things in the world, the way of eudaimonia, requires me to recognize that the abstract, or that is, or like the principles and virtues are good. So love, courage, and so forth, such virtues, principles, if these are what are truly good, and we want to start to shed then this sort of materiality that we get so wrapped up in, right? Pretty much the opposite of Aristippus, pretty much the opposite of the Cyrenaics, in the sense that no, indulge in those things, take pleasure in those things. That is the only way you can get even close to cultivating happiness and the good life. Then this is the opposite, and this is like no. Socrates was all about. He was always walking around with shabby clothes and all that. It wasn't just because he was poor and such. He lived that way on purpose. He wanted to emphasize, and he emphasized for himself, how little value material things have, and so we should get rid of these things ourselves. Now, this ends up trickling down into Stoicism. How has this come about? What does cynicism have to do with Stoicism? Gaarder only mentions that it was influential. Didn't say how. Cynicism has a bit of an issue. There's a problem in cynicism, specifically that not everybody can afford to be a cynic, to make a little bit of a pun out of that. Cynicism would seem to require, if you get rid of all your material possessions and do like Diogenes and live in a barrel and all that stuff, as admirable as that may be to some people, if you start to go that way in life, note the fact that you still have to go around, you still have to beg for food, you still end up requiring civilization, some form of people nearby in order to help sustain you, it's unsustainable. You end up relying on the very thing that you're criticizing all the time. So when Diogenes is reputed to have gone around with a lantern and said, when someone asks, what are you, in the middle of the day, like a lantern, what are you doing, Diogenes? And he says, oh, I'm looking for an honest man. Like, that's cute and all. And it's interesting. And maybe we can even derive some wisdom from that in some form or other. But it also is sort of like, yeah, that's about all he had to offer in reality, perhaps. Because if we were to take on the version of society the Cynics were talking about, then we wouldn't have anything. Like, there wouldn't be a strata on which the Cynics could even live to talk about their philosophy in the first place. So this became acknowledged by those like Zeno of Citium, who saw and tried to be a Cynic himself before he finally said, you know what? The problem is these people, these Cynics, are so trying to be so anti-materialistic that they become materialistic. This was actually something said to me as well back in the day. Back not long after I got out of college, I had a friend who heard me go on, and I ranted for a while about, material pleasures and so forth as really being inconsequential, and if anything, being a distraction and so forth. And she had a wonderful, at the time, I didn't take it very well, but she was a friend, so I handled it to the best of my ability. But she said at the time, Kelsey, the problem is that you are so against materialism that you end up buying into materialism. What does that mean? Think about Diogenes and so forth again, right? If you are so concentrated on ridding yourself of these material pleasures and so forth, that ends up being most of all you're doing and all you're thinking about. But wasn't the whole point of getting rid of these material pleasures and such in order to focus on the good, in order to focus on the virtues and the principles? Now, Diogenes and others probably did do that, but people like Zeno looked at this and said, this won't be applicable for everybody. Not everyone's going to be able to do this. One, you won't have a society on which cynicism can continue and be sustainable, but also not everybody's going to be in a position where it works for the greater good, for everybody's greater good, to get rid of all their things. What about the emperors and governors and such who also need to do their jobs in order to help keep society running well? He says, if you are anybody who is anybody, you should be able to practice such a philosophy and it work, right? Regardless of your material wealth. In other words, kind of like, so if Aristotle is over here saying, actually, this is a necessary thing is to have some material wealth and such, the conditions for a good education and so forth and to live well, then Stoicism is over here sort of in between these two extremes. Aristotle's, you need this, and Cynics, you need not to have this, with it doesn't matter. That's not the important thing here. Stoicism seems to say we should focus on rather the principles and virtues and how to live those out, and not so much the things of material wealth. Okay, so we've talked about these branches at large. Let's take a look at some key individuals. So here is Diogenes, that famous scene of Diogenes in the barrel, Alexander the Great coming up to him, just as Gaarder described. Alexander had heard of him through others for a while, and then he finally comes to visit him and sees him in the barrel, offers him wealth, offers him, just asks him, like, what is it you would truly, what I can give it to you, what would you want? Wise Diogenes. And Diogenes responds, I want you to stand out of my sunlight, right? Like he's trying to sunbathe. Now, one thing that Gaarder leaves out is that Alexander is reputed to have walked away from that encounter saying, were I not Alexander, may I have been Diogenes. Which, if he really said that, is pretty profound when you think about it. Had I not been this person, this great leader, this, he has changed the face of the Mediterranean. He's changed the face of history, for better or worse, might say some historians, but he has definitely been an impact. And he has changed cultures. He has brought people together as well as later torn them apart. But he says explicitly then, had I not been this person with this wealth, with this power, with this ability and so forth, may I have been this. This would seem to be the exact opposite of all those things. No power, no money, seemingly no impact. But perhaps that's the facade. Maybe that's the illusion. Maybe they're closer together than we might think. To live to such an extreme and to have such a dedication and commitment to one's values, which is, we can't argue with this. This is what Diogenes and other cynics, Antisthenes and others were definitely doing. Maybe there's more to say about that after all. We are talking about them right now. Thousands of years later, we're still talking about them. So maybe there's more likeness there than we give credit for. Here's Marcus Aurelius, the one only closest thing we've ever had to a true philosopher king, as it were. Literally, a philosopher who was in a place of power, an emperor, Roman emperor. He wrote the Meditations, which has influenced later philosophy, or Stoicism specifically, but philosophy in some ways forever. He is a really interesting figure. Because of those writings, we know so much about what he was dealing with and struggling with. He clearly was a pacifist, but he also was, as the Roman emperor, having to lead these crusades against the Gauls. So how does he reconcile that in himself, having on the one hand the values of peace and so forth, and on the other hand doing this really difficult, bloody job of being a Roman emperor? Well, Stoicism for him really saves the day, because he's trying to recognize that while his own feelings be what they are and his attempt to live those values be what they are, there's also the world outside of himself. This is something, again, that we seem to see less and less of in more recent, not just philosophy, but the way people live in general these days in this particular culture, maybe even a global culture at this point, is we tend to live life for ourselves, and we tend to change the environment to suit what we want and what we perceive our needs to be. That's not the Stoics of this time and later times. Epictetus and many others go on to say that life is doing what it does. The world is as it is. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Kind of Aristotelian. And we can only respond. The only real thing we have control over or power over is how we ourselves respond to what is. And that response may have to end up condoning things that we would never wish to have happen in the world, and yet maybe the only way to long-term peace. If maybe Marcus Aurelius really wants peace in the world, maybe he sees one of the means of getting there as having to do his job as the Roman emperor, fight the Gauls, and stop these barbaric crusades coming in and creating chaos for the people. This is a Stoic view. So it's not just what do I believe and how do I make the world start to conform to me a little bit more, which still kind of reeks of cynicism, but how do I respond to what is in the world and carry out these values and virtues I believe in? And then there's Epicurus. Epicurus, who again is from that other branch, responding to these questions of the Cyrenaics and so forth. How do we live a good life? What is happiness? Is happiness something we can directly earn? What is pleasure in that? And what you'll see is that Epicurus goes this other route. He goes with something that's called aponia, and which is more like the suspension, not so much the indulgence and pleasure, but the suspension of pain as a way of getting to the end game, which for Epicurus and his followers, really is happiness. We want to cultivate happiness directly. Now, he's also known for saying things like, a little bit of cheese with a meal is a feast, can be at least a feast. This is where these sort of more negative terms of Epicureanism have come up. When you're called an Epicurean these days, it tends to emphasize the idea that you indulge in these pleasures, which is the exact opposite of what he was prescribed to. It's funny, why don't we call those people Cyrenaics or Cyrenians or something? I don't know. It's very weird how this goes about. I sort of have a sense of historically why people were critical of Epicurus, and maybe that led to using the name Epicureanism as this sort of placeholder for anybody who thinks that hedonism is a good idea. He is a hedonist. He does think that these pleasures and so forth are an important aspect to becoming happy and the end goal of being happy. But he's saying that there is a very different way to go about it. You don't want to indulge in every single little, pleasure or impulse that comes up for you. Rather, we have to think about long-term effects. Will this thing that I'm about to do actually contribute to my long-term happiness? Or is this just a sort of short-term pleasure, the effects of which may end up more easily guaranteeing a lack of happiness later in the future? I like to use, the question of whether or not I should eat my vegetables in a given instance, or if I should just have cake for dinner. Well, I clearly, if I'm Cyrenaic enough, I'm going to go for that cake. But Epicurus would be saying, unlike, critics of his who would say, oh, he's going to go for the cake. No, oppositely, he's probably going to look at that situation and go, actually, the fruit and vegetables that I might be, I'm comparing to the cake and thinking of as less sweet and less delicious, they actually are fairly delicious in their own right. If you've ever cleared your palate for long enough of sugar, you realize that fruit is very, very, very sweet. And vegetables themselves, celery and such, actually have a little bit of that sweetness as well. They all have sugars in them, actually. And our sort of refined sugars tend to overwhelm our taste buds, and we tend to not be able to appreciate those little subtle flavors anymore. If you don't believe me, try it. Try to go for about a month without eating anything of refined sugar. Really hard to do. If you buy food, it's really hard to do. Any processed food practically has sugar in it. And then try that. And then you'll start to note how what really appeals to me about the cake is already somewhat present in this other thing. And the difference is actually really extraordinary, because if I indulge in the cake now and I, in this sort of Cyrenaic way, continue to indulge in that cake in future dinners, I'm eventually going to be fat, right? Or I'm at least, or diabetic. I'm going to have all sorts of problems that are going to not contribute to my happiness in the long term, but inhibit my long-term happiness. Versus the vegetables and so forth and fruit that already have elements of the thing that I seek pleasure in or find pleasure in, I'm going to derive benefits from that. So this is what Epicureanism really is. He and his friends are said to have lived together. His philosopher friends are said to have lived together in this garden. It's called today the Garden. He wrote possibly more even than Aristotle, believe it or not, 300 plus scrolls. We have very little of either of their works in the end. That there's so much that he has actually contributed, and he is, again, along with Stoicism, one of the two philosophies that still stands a chance of being appreciated today. Stoicism, as it were, it's important to say so. Stoicism is far from dead itself, the farthest from dead, actually. Stoicism is, of these that I've described just now, specifically skepticism and Epicureanism and Stoicism is actually the one that's still alive today. Go online, look up Stoic, and you will find that there are tons of blogs. There's something called the Stoicon, where every year annually people gather as Stoics to appreciate Stoicism. There's been a huge movement towards Stoicism.
So my argument is, look, building and leading things are scary, and ego is kind of a defense mechanism from dealing with the reality of that fear and that terror.
Big business leaders are often, if they indulge in any philosophy at all, tend to drift towards Stoicism in light of wanting to live out their virtues and principles while also mostly responding to the way that the world is and often achieving great things that way. So Stoicism of these three is probably the most relevant to contemporary ethics. All right. A word on Plotinus. We actually are, you might have noticed, Plotinus was not on that chart. Plotinus is going to push us into the more classical period that I mentioned earlier. We're actually moving forward by great leaps. Even after, so Epicurus influenced another really great Roman thinker, Lucretius, who wrote, on nature. And even more beyond that point, we're going past the descendant followers of Epicurus. Plato and Aristotle have been branching off for a while themselves for some time, but then Plotinus comes into the picture. And Plotinus creates this new philosophy. This is an image called the Great Chain of Being. This is, or at least this image is depicting his concept of the Great Chain of Being. And what we can sort of think of it as is an amalgamation of the work of Plato and his forms and Aristotle and his sort of hierarchy of beings. What do I mean by that? So if you look closely at this illustration here, this is a medieval, or not medieval, sorry, 16th century piece by Diego Valdés. So it has that sort of older character to it. But if you take a look at the illustration in a little bit more detail, let's hone in for a second. So you can see at the top, there's this sort of king. This is, in a sense, God. But this is not Christian yet. Christians do exist during this time. Early Christianity has developed and is starting to spread. But this is not in any way directly associated with Christianity. However, there is the God in the sense of this goodness, this ultimate good, Plato's good, and the perfection and all the things that we were projecting onto that good in Plato are here in Plotinus. And if we look the rest of the world sort of in its importance and in its perfection, incrementally degrades as you go farther down the map. We get sort of the daemon type and angel-looking characters here. Probably not exactly what Plotinus was thinking of, the whole thing with wings and so forth. Remember, this is a 16th century depiction of this. But you get the idea. Sort of the not human, but just above, between human and God realm. And then as we further go down the map, you can see humans as the next tier down. There they are. Just a degree away from being things like these daemon or archangels and so forth. Go further down, and here's the realm of fish, birds, animals, right? And then one more down, you've got plants and the earth on which they rest. So, and then, of course, farther down, and this is where the darkness truly dwells, you have perhaps beings that live in that darkness. And this resonates very much of Christian ideals, and rightly so. Christianity took on Neoplatonism pretty heavily during the Middle Ages and was majorly influenced by it. But we want to ask the question, where do the ideas for this concept come from? Well, on the one hand, you saw Plato's good up at the top, and then we have Aristotelian sense of sort of the order of complexity, to use a more modern term, of organisms. So for Aristotle, and we didn't talk about this much last time, but there's this sort of vegetative soul, there's more of an animal soul, and then there's a human soul. And it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but more or less, if you think about a vegetable that lives and clearly has needs, but cannot move around on its own will, which is not true, some plants actually do, but let's ignore the exceptions and just think about stereotypically speaking, then that vegetative soul is dominated or overshadowed in a sense, or at least inferior to the animal soul, which is one that is capable of walking around, mobile. It can actually get its own needs met, right? So I mean, in a way, this is speaking to a reality. Plants are their means of getting food and so forth requires photosynthesis. They have to stand. They stand where they are most of the time anyway, and things happen to them. They can only do so much in response. But animals have a very different means of getting their needs met. They can actually go out. They can't eat sunlight, but they can eat the plants. They can eat other animals. They can get their needs met. Humans all the more, because humans have the intellectual portion. We actually can dwell on the circumstances of our setting and ask, oh, not just how do I move to get my needs met? How can I actually make it possible that my needs will already be only a few feet away in the kitchen downstairs? The fridge is right there. I can just make it possible for my needs to be met easily by using my intellect and appropriating the technology and other things that I need in order to get my needs met more easily and so forth. Now, I'm using the word soul, as Aristotle was sort of using as well, but that's it. We're talking about the kinds of beings, really. What essences there were to the actual beings that are in the world. And so here, Plotinus has taken that on full swing. So here at the lower rung is all that vegetative business. Here's the animal world, and here are humans. But then again, there's more than that too, because Aristotle even himself believed in this idea of an unmoved mover, or a prime mover is what some people call it. Aristotle is using logic here to try and solve this problem of where the world comes from. Remember that question? And he comes up with this idea of the unmoved mover. There had to be something that eventually we get back to that wasn't moved by anything else. Moving here just means causing, let's say. So we tend to think of the Big Bang, for instance. But then you can still ask the question, what came before the Big Bang? Or what caused the Big Bang? And that's, for some people anyway, a legitimate question. For Aristotle, he says in principle, there should be something that did not originate from anything else. It wasn't caused by anything else, but then began this domino effect of everything else happening from that point forward, long before the Big Bang was conceived or anything like that. And this is part of this conception here too. So both Plato with the good, the ultimate good, and Aristotle with this unmoved mover or primary mover, prime mover, they are featured here in this conception of the world. And Plotinus is the one who creates the Aeneads that describes all of this, combining Plato and Aristotle into what is no longer either one of them, but what we call today Neoplatonism. This all comes about because of this thing called syncretism. To be syncretic means, it's usually a term these days used when it comes to religion. So we can say that there are some arguments that all religions to some extent are syncretic, in that they absorb and take in different elements and different themes in order to depict their own imagery and convey their own messages. But I like to pose it particularly to assimilation. So think about the Romans again for a moment. When the Romans would go out and they'd conquer a new land, it was not usually the case that they would force everybody to give up their religions and take on their pantheon of Roman gods. That would have been an assimilation type situation where their religion assimilates others and might take in aspects of them, but then ultimately dominates in that world or in that culture. Now, contrast that with syncretism, where syncretism, where you have cultures that come into contact, instead of one overcoming the other and maybe absorbing it and taking some elements. Rather, it's where there's almost an absorption, like the two become one in some instances, or at least one. It's never perfectly done, of course, but one often takes on other elements, even ones that are not just re-explained or reinterpreted by the themes already present in that first religion or culture, but also ends up maybe even morphing the story or changing very changing elements of it in such a way that often new religions are born. And this is partly what is happening here. You've got, you could say, not a religion, but the thought of Plato and the thought of Aristotle. And here, syncretically, rather than one being more right than the other, they are sort of blended together, not in some hodgepodge way, but in a way that they actually seem to be compatible with one another. And you get a new realm of thought. You get a new philosophy. You get Neoplatonism. It's often also described as mystical, which is important, because if you think about it, so where is Plotinus getting this idea? What is it specifically he's getting from Plato and from Aristotle? Because Plato is this dualist. He believed in this material world, and matter is this imperfection and so forth. And then you've got the more abstract, highest of good that only our minds can access. There's a dualism there. There's the material and the immaterial for him. And what Plotinus does, and this doesn't gel well with Aristotle, and it doesn't gel, Aristotle in this sort of more material, primarily materialist way, not 100%, but let's just call it that. Material is required for substance to be, as we said last time. How does this work out? How do you get those two to be compatible? I have a ball here, and as you can see, it looks purely white. And this is the way that Plotinus sort of thinks about it. If I shine a light on it, you can see that one side of the ball, the little poofy ball thing, is very bright and lit up, and the other side is dark. That theme of the lightness and the darkness that we saw in that illustration, that we're seeing in the illustration, light to dark, that is what's at play here. There's still only one thing, but says Plotinus, what Plato gets right about this is that one side of that one thing seems to, it doesn't seem to, it is the good. It is the ultimate divine perfection. The other side is simply not lit up. That is, it's still all one thing, but the only real difference between the light and the dark, as it were, or the material and the immaterial, or the good and the evil, is that one side lacks light. It's a matter of degree, not kind. There's that very important logical distinction to make. We always have to ask ourselves, are things different by degree or by kind? And Plotinus says everything is a monism. We'll get into that word more later on, but really all things are one. That question of the one and the many, everything's one. It's a matter of degree, a difference of degree only. How far things are from the good or from the ultimate light, that we have this hierarchy laid out, this and the world that we see, and we dwell primarily in the world that's somewhere in between those two extremes. And so we can kind of get a good sense of both, a good sense of either. But ultimately, what is our goal? Well, the light, because there's not really two things. It's one thing. It's the light. And so for him, unlike Plato and his cave analogy, where you have to by some figure like Socrates be sometimes dragged out of the cave in order to get to a higher realization, to acquire wisdom. Plotinus says, no, we're all naturally inclined towards the good. We all want to go toward the light, right? That's pretty different in that respect. And yet it still very well accommodates what Plato and, to some extent, what Aristotle are trying to say. The way that Plotinus comes up with the Aeneads, the way he comes up with this concept of the great chain of being and so forth, is by way of religious experience. See, part of what is defining the need for these Hellenistic philosophers before Plotinus, and then Plotinus himself and others, what is it that's prompting them to come up with these philosophies? Aristotle and Plato did a lot of good. They could just do reinterpretations purely on those. What's with this whole thing too about focusing on how to live life and all, and why is there a new focus? It seems a newfound focus on those things, because this is a really tumultuous time that we were just describing. Remember that? And there is a lot of good that Romans did for technology. They invented things like roads and aqueduct systems. There's lots of incredible things they did for the world. They obviously changed the face of the world such that we wouldn't be the same people today if it weren't for them and all of that. There's also some really horrific things that happened during these times. It was always possible that your family could just at any moment, as it were, be, let's say, processed, to use a kind euphemism, processed by some local registrant or district leader or governor, and your wife and or husband would belong to someone else as a slave, or your children could go into slavery. You could all be used for any sort of other purposes, for pleasure, or maybe thrown, including entertainment created by throwing you into the gladiator pits. This time when just about any terrible thing could happen if there was enough corruption and royalty nearby to be corrupt. This is awful, and people are looking for hope. They're looking for a way of life that gives them a reason to keep living. This is why things like Christianity starts to take off, in fact, because it provides a very helpful solution to this problem. Yeah, life right now looks really dim for most of us. Fortunately, if you live a truly good life by following this thinker, Jesus of Nazareth, and his ways, then you will find salvation after this life. So, can't find appeal in this life, look for the appeal after this life. It's not the only religion that does this either, but it starts to take off, particularly with that kind of branded message. And there's a lot of Jewish thought that is coming across as compatible with Plato at this time, so there's some syncretism happening there. So Neoplatonism was born out of this, not out of things like Christianity specifically, but out of this movement of some Jewish thought for sure, religion and other things, trying to help us get in touch with something greater than ourselves. What Plotinus is claiming is that there have been 4, possibly 6 or more times in his life where he's actually, in this sort of meditative, mystical way, experienced oneness with the great divine. Experienced it, not just talked about it, experienced it. And so this gives way to that mysticism. This gives way to that way of thinking about the world, where you have on the one hand religions and their creation myths and maybe even some of their other ideological idiosyncrasies, and then you have philosophy and such, but all of these just stand to talk about the world and not necessarily dwell on the experience of the world. Mysticism as this enlightened attainment of usually considered a hidden aspect of reality or truth of reality. This is not just religious. This is, in a sense, religion may end up being the vehicle for such a thing, for mysticism to happen, for a mystical experience to take place. But it is really something almost a-religious, that is non-religious in some sense. It seems to take place where you get a direct confrontation with what the really real is, with reality itself. None of this like sophistical, reality is whatever you make of it. No, this is reality and its hardcoreness, and you get to experience it. But it all ultimately comes down to getting in touch with the real, which is, we could argue, one of philosophy's greatest attributes is this desire in the pursuit of wisdom to do such a thing. Not just talk about it, but experience, come into contact in some way with the real. And then what about eudaimonia? What happened to that? Well, simple. Eudaimonia is that union with the good. So while Plotinus, unlike the earlier Hellenistic thinkers, is much more interested in the metaphysics, what is real, not just how do you live, but what is real, he still accommodates that too. He says, yes, eudaimonia, the good life. Here it is, union with the one. That's what Socrates was all about. But unlike Socrates, who thinks that you only really get to reunite with the one after death because of the impurity of form and all that, impurity of material and all that, not for Plotinus. No, you can have it now. He did it 4 times. You can have it right now. And that will change, again, the way that religion and mystical experience is talked about, and later how medieval and Middle Age thinkers confront philosophy. There's so much more to say here, really, when it comes to this and what we're going to be going into soon, medieval time period. It's so common to pass over a lot of what's going on as if not very much was going on. It's the opposite is true. We pass over it despite the fact that there are so many influences, there's so many great thinkers, but we are going to be zooming through them fairly quickly. On that note, I'll see you again next time.